All right, so the last lesson we talked about Roosevelt and kind of the progressive movement in general terms, and now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the specific things with Roosevelt. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail on some of these. I do want to mention them, though, because they're worth mentioning. But your book is going to talk about some of these in detail, and that's really where I want you to get the ideas from the book. I'm just going to kind of explain and point out some of the major legislation or laws that Roosevelt passed. So we're going to look at we're going to look at a bunch, but we're going to categorize or break down Roosevelt's program into three major things. And the first one is land conservation. The second one is trust busting, which we've talked about in previous lessons. The third one is consumer protection, or protecting the people, and we talked about that in the last lesson. In this next slide, we see Roosevelt and land. Now, Roosevelt passed with Congress and Roosevelt together. Congress makes law, the president signs it and says it's okay, and then enforces that law. They passed the Antiquity Act in 1906. Now, the Antiquities Act allows the president to preserve land without congressional approval. And there came a point where Congress thought that Roosevelt was protecting more land than he should. So they passed another law that said no more land can be protected in some of these states out west. And Roosevelt signed that bill into law. But before he signed that bill into law, he protected several million more acres and signed this under the Antiquities Act. And then he signed a law that said no more lands preserved in these 6 states out west. Altogether, Roosevelt protected or saved 100 million acres, more than 100 million acres. And he created 5 national parks. If you look at the next slide, we'll see a picture, very beautiful. This is Crater Lake in Oregon, very, very beautiful to visit. A little island there, volcanic island. It's not volcanic anymore, but or it's not active. On the next slide, we see the Grand Canyon. Now, Roosevelt didn't protect the Grand Canyon as a national park. He protected it as a preserve, which is one step below a national park. But the Grand Canyon is today a national park, also very beautiful in several states, but also in Arizona is the big state it's in. Roosevelt is a trust buster. Now, this we talked about, and so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here. But I do want to point out a few things that he does. He passes the Northern Securities Act with Congress in 1902. This is Teddy Roosevelt versus J.P. Morgan, the banker, and the railroads. And you can look more about that and the ones that follow in your book. Trust busting. President McKinley, remember, was the first to bust monopolies, but Teddy Roosevelt brought 44 companies to law. He sued them and broke them or tried to break them apart, and many of them he did. Taft brought suit against 99 companies. So Taft actually did far more trust busting than Roosevelt did. Now, on the next slide, we see that the United Mine Workers Act in 1902, the mine workers against the mine owners, and Roosevelt told the mine owners, if you don't give more pay to the mine workers, I'm going to take your mines over and they're going to belong to the government. And the mine owner said, Mr. President, you can't do that. And he said, you're right, maybe I can't, but I'm going to do it anyway. And so in the end, the miners were given 9-hour workdays, and they had a 10% pay increase, which is a good thing. Mines were not very safe then. And you know today, in China and in the United States, that sometimes people go into the coal mines underground and there's an explosion or the mine caves in and people die. And so Roosevelt was trying to give a square deal or a fair deal to everyone. And he called it the square deal. On the next slide, we see the Elkins Act and the Hepburn Act. One is in 1903 and the other is in 1906. And here he's regulating railroad rates so that railroad companies cannot give super cheap rates to one company and not to another company, so that the rates that they pay have to be the same. So if you go to the train station and you decide that you want to go from your hometown to, let's say you want to take a train to Guangzhou in southern China, and so the railroad company, they look at you and they like you and they say, I'm going to give you a free ticket And then the person behind you, they decide they're going to charge them 100 renminbi or $100 to ride the train. That's not fair to the person behind you, is it? And so this is one thing Roosevelt wanted to make sure didn't happen. He also passed laws that and regulations involving child labor, limiting the number of hours that people could work, make sure that you have paid holiday, protection for government workers. So all kinds of different things that he put in place and Congress put in place to protect people. If we look at the next slide, we see the Food and Drug Act of 1906 and the Meat Inspection Act also of 1906. And if you look at any food today in the United States, and you can look at the back of that food and you can see that it is required to have the ingredients, whatever is inside of that food, whatever food or chemicals, the company that makes that food has to tell you. And that's inside, that's because of the Food and Drug Act of 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act. But also, they wanted to make sure that the food was safe. Because in 1900 and 1906, more people died from disease that you can catch from food or from the air than any other diseases, not cancer. A lot of people were food poisoning, a lot of tuberculosis, and a lot of these things you can get from food. So, and so the Pure Food and Drug Act aimed to make people, to protect people, to make their eating more healthy. And also the Meat Inspection Act. So the meat seller, the butcher, cannot sell you rotten meat, and there's laws against that. So maybe the meat is not good, maybe it's good for a dog, or maybe it's not even good for a dog. Before 1906, the meat seller can still sell the meat that's not good for a dog to you. After 1906, it cannot. In 1908, look at the next slide, we can see that on this next slide, half the country in the South votes for William Jennings Bryan, who ran in 1896, remember, and half the country votes for President Taft. Now, President Taft is from Ohio, and this is the first time he's running. Teddy Roosevelt is finished being president, and Taft is hand-chosen by Roosevelt to be the next president. He wants him to be the next president. And Taft wins, and here's a picture of Taft on the next page. Now, Taft attacked, look at the next slide, he attacked 90 plus or 99 trusts or monopolies. Now, Taft didn't care if it was a good company or a bad company. If it was a company that was too big and had too much power, he wanted to break it apart. Roosevelt did care. If it was a bad company, he'd break it. If it was a good company, he'd leave it alone. So in 1912, because Teddy Roosevelt doesn't like Taft, in 1912, Teddy Roosevelt decides to run for president again. And if you're running for president again, after Taft's first time in office, it must mean you don't like Taft very much. And it's true. Teddy Roosevelt didn't like Taft, and he decides to run for president in 1912. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next lesson. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.